He is the director of the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation, and he is also the professor of French in Trinity College. Those titles, however, don't tell you the full story, because for 30 years or more he has been a leading scholar and author in the field of translation studies. His interests span the entire spectrum of the humanities, from anthropology to philosophy to history and the languages and literatures of the world. In more recent times, he has expanded his interests to the sciences, and in particular, he has considered the relationship between translation and what we would term the natural world, such as the esteem in which he is held internationally that a two-day conference was organised in the UK last year, exclusively devoted to his published work. What is perhaps less publicly known is that he is also an inspirational teacher and mentor, which I can personally vouch for. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce, on the subject of translation, ecology and deep time, Professor Michael Cronin.
Thank you very much, John, for that very, very kind introduction. I suppose what I'm going to concentrate on in the time that I have is looking at this notion of what the human means in the notion of the human translator and human translation. I suppose one of the things, when I think about it over the years, since I became interested in the phenomenon of translation and translators, is looking at or thinking about the relationship between translation, translators, and wider political, social, and cultural issues. I think to some extent, if there's a kind of cognitive backbone in what I've been doing over the years, it would be something like that. So I want to begin with the name of a volcano that I have great difficulty pronouncing, but I think it goes something like this. Efea tla ea kutl. So my deepest apologies to any speakers of Icelandic in the audience. But in 2010, many of you in this room will remember that this volcano in Iceland erupted. And the effects of the eruption were immediate and dramatic. European air traffic came to a total standstill for 6 days. Tens of thousands of passengers found themselves stranded in airports, not knowing when their flights would eventually take off. In terms of carbon emissions, however, the volcano released about 40% of Europe's daily air traffic emissions, roughly 150,000 tonnes on a daily basis. So if we take the average 100 million tonnes that humans emit every day and divide it by the 150,000 tonnes emitted by the Icelandic volcano, we land on the diabolical number 666. As the Icelandic writer and ecological activist Andri Snær Magnusson puts it, the emissions of the Earth's inhabitants are like 666 Icelandic volcanic eruptions day and night all year round. The consequences of this level of disruption puts a strain on the very language that we use to describe it. He says, when a system collapses, language is released from its moorings. Words meant to encapsulate reality hang empty in the air, no longer applicable to anything. Textbooks are rendered obsolete overnight, and overly complex hierarchies fade away. People suddenly find it difficult to hit upon the right phrasing to articulate concepts that match their reality. So, in trying to imagine the scale of anthropogenic climate change, we reach for a vision of a hellish range of volcanoes endlessly blowing up our world. Conceiving of humans as geological agents, unleashing devastating force on a human historic timescale, rather than a planetary geological one, is profoundly unsettling. In the context of the potential collapse of human life support systems, what happens to the words that we use to encapsulate translation realities? Have our translation textbooks become obsolete overnight? I want to try and answer these questions by focusing on a core argument in the recent book by Cobus Mare from 2019, A Biosemiotic Theory of Translation, where he makes the case for the centrality of time to any adequate representation of the process of translation. He feels that spatial metaphors and notion spatialization tends to get overemphasized in the theorization and conceptualization of what we do in translation. So, noting the operation of time in a semiotic process in which the text is always caught up in a continuous chain of antecedent and subsequent semiotic processes, he claims that translation studies, and I quote, needs to consider its mainly spatial conceptualization of meaning as supplemented with a temporal conceptualization of meaning. That is, moving from three-dimensional to four-dimensional thinking and modeling when it comes to translation. So, if we are to reinstate time as a foundational category in this four-dimensional model, the question that might be asked in an age of unprecedented climate change is, what kind of time are we talking about? What exactly is the time that we envisage? The Indian theorist Dipesh Chakrabarty has, of course, famously argued that when the cumulative outcome of human activities is equivalent to the action of geological forces, humans shift from being biological agents, which they always have been, if you like, in their interactions with the environment, to becoming geological agents. The abbreviated time of human history gives way to the deep history of vastly extended geological timeframes. Timothy Clark claims that this newfound status is one to which most humans are oblivious. The newly recognized agent of humanity as a geological force is something indiscernible in any of the individuals or even large groups of which it is composed. It is a power that barely recognizes itself as such and which is not really capable of voluntary action or planning, as it arises from the often unforeseen consequences of the plans and acts of its constituents. So one of the things that Clark is arguing is how difficult it is to think about a time and how we feature in this new extended notion of what constitutes deep time. So if the discovery of deep time by Charles Lyell and others was profoundly disturbing for fundamentalist Christians in the 19th century, one of the things, of course, at the time, there was a belief that the world began in 4004 BC, which was one of the contributions of a former fellow of college here, James Ussher, who came up with this time. And of course, when Lyell showed in the geological records that the Earth had existed for a great deal longer than that, this was profoundly upsetting for a lot of people's notions of what constituted the principle of divine creation. So if it was that kind of notion of deep time was upsetting in the 19th century, identifying how deep history is relevant to human agency in the early 21st century is unsettling for a much broader constituency of humans and not just fundamental Christians. However, it can be argued that human entanglement in deep time is not recent because humans as an evolved species have always been involved in it. The species itself has an origin that is deep in time. As Darwin, among others, would of course demonstrate. Jeremy Davis, in his recent book, The Birth of the Anthropocene, says, the Anthropocene, in other words, does not fasten human beings into a geological chronology from which they had previously been separate. There never was any such separation, although it is true that the timescales of plate tectonics once had very little practical relevance to the timescales of political economy. What the Anthropocene provides is a way to conceptualize human society's participation in deep time, a participation that had always existed and that has taken on practical salience under the peculiar circumstances of the present day. So, given that the Anthropocene for Clarke provides a way of conceptualizing human society's participation in deep time, we can legitimately ask, I think, what happens when we place one of those activities that humans engage in, namely translation? So what happens when we put that within the context of deep time? I want to suggest that there are three types of translation practices that are both initiated and recovered by integrating deep time into our understanding of translation and its material life. So these are geotranslation, terra translation, and what I'm going to call nuclear translation. At the end of 2017, the Fondation Martin Bodmer in Geneva organized an exhibition entitled Les routes de la traduction, Babel, Genève. And so the trails, the routes of translation, Babel in Geneva. It was partly inspired by another exhibition on the theme of translation held in Marseille a year earlier called Après Babel, Traduire. So the Swiss exhibition drew on the rich holdings of the foundation and included a multitude of texts and translations from ancient Egypt to the modern era. Barbara Cassin, a famous French theorist of translation, notably associated with Emily Apter with the notion of the untranslatable, in an introductory essay to the catalogue accompanying the exhibition, speaks of translation as a kind of reinvention. She says, La traduction est de fait un savoir-faire avec les différences. Translation, in effect, is a way of knowing how to deal with difference. So, what both the Marseille and the Geneva exhibitions strove to emphasize was the role of translation as a generator of cultural and linguistic difference, introducing new ideas, reviving lost concepts, and rejuvenating flagging vernaculars. However, in both instances, the concept of translation was exclusively linked to texts, writing systems, and interlingual contact. The exhibition, if you like, owed their existence to the material artifacts of translation, the documents on a variety of supports from clay to papyrus to vellum, which can be displayed and described. However, limiting the material life of translation to the relatively brief period during the Holocene, when writing systems emerge, means radically abbreviating the fact of translation in human experience. To see translation as uniquely beholden to recorded human history is to make translation a hostage to a concept of anthropocentric time, which has been radically undermined by the advent of the Anthropocene. Daniel Lord Smale has pointed out that only a small fraction of what we know about the human past comes to us through printed words. What does it matter, he says, that the evidence for the deep past comes not from written documents, but from other things that teach, from artifacts, fossils, vegetable remains, phonemes, and various forms of modern DNA. Like written documents, all these traces encode information about the past. Like written documents, they resist an easy reading and must be interpreted with care. While Smale does not use the word translation, he talks about traces that resist an easy reading and must be interpreted with care. This is clearly a translational project, as the traces must somehow be made intelligible to us across relatively short or indeed greatly extended periods of time. The fact that these material vestiges are not expressed in written form does not negate the need for translation. Paleontology, as the study of ancient life, primarily through fossil evidence, is in a sense a kind of translational discipline. It seeks to understand life forms, human and non-human, that are from a deep past and are mostly not represented in written forms of symbolic communication. I propose the term geotranslation to describe a form of translation that seeks to interpret non-written material remains from a past that can extend indefinitely beyond recorded human history. By integrating the notion of deep time into translation, geotranslation signals the changed ontological status of humans as geological agents who increasingly recognize their inescapable implication in the geological life of the planet. Cobus Murray, discussing C.S. Peirce's analysis of a chemist and a paleontologist studying fossilized fish in a stone, tracks in semiotic terms the conjunction of translation and materiality. The chemist who analyzes the stone and the paleontologist who studies the fossil of the fish are both fulfilling a translation function, creating an interpretant from a material representment. This shows that in Peircean thought, it is not only words and thoughts that can be mutually translated, but material reality can be translated into thought too. The operation of geotranslation can be seen in a study a recent study of bird brain evolution, which asked the simple question: why large brains and high intelligence emerge in some avian lineages and not others? So when we talk about somebody being bird-brained, it's actually not very scientifically accurate, because some birds are remarkably smart. So this question in turn is linked to the specific emergence of human intelligence and what these different forms of evolution might or might not have in common. As one of the authors of the study observed, despite being the only vertebrates with brain expansion levels that approach those observed in mammals, birds had long garnered only a fraction of the research effort. So determining the nature of the evolution of the brain is not easy, because brains, of course, decay rapidly and leave poor fossil records. Using fossil evidence is still possible, however, because the brain is contained within a bony box in the skull called the brain case. So through the use of industrial micro CT scanners, virtual endocasts can be developed, and these give researchers an accurate indication of the size of the brains in the cases and how these evolve, if you like, over time. So by tracking changes in avian body and brain sizes over tens of millions of years, researchers established that the prodigious leap forward in avian intelligence occurred after the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction of about 66 million years ago. So what they call the brain-body scaling slope, the relationship between body size and brain size, took on very different configurations in different avian species. The vertebrate paleontologist Daniel T. Kespa asked the question, how could a mass extinction trigger such a diversification? In reply, he states that the most common explanation is the cognitive buffer hypothesis, which posits that large brains provide a buffer against a frequent or unexpected environmental changes by allowing more flexible behavioral responses. So, studies of modern birds, for example, have shown that island-dwelling birds have developed much larger brains than their continental counterparts because island environments are inherently more unstable. Whereas a continental bird can move to another part of the landmass in response to a threat, an island-based bird has to develop some form of adaptive mechanism while staying put, because they simply don't have the same range or degree of options. Something I think that has been adequately understood by the pigeons that gather in such numbers here in Trinity College, Dublin. They seem to be at home in this kind of island setting. So, linking, if you like, a geological event to a material analysis of brain case size and a theory of adaptive intelligence is a form of geotranslation, which involves an interpretation of events occurring beyond the realm of human language and human historical time, but which is ultimately translated into human language in the form of symbolic language and a scientific article. The event, if you like, described is, in a sense, translated across deep history. The reconfiguration of timescales, that is one marker of a shift in human sensibility in the Anthropocene, opens up, I would argue, new perspectives for translation studies. And I'm acutely conscious of making remarks like this because so many of you are young scholars at the start of your career. You're also entering into, you're already in a world that's profoundly marked by climate change and will continue to be so in more and more dramatic ways. So I think thinking about these questions is quite crucial. So the first perspective is that incorporating deep time into our horizon of reflection means that translation can be integrated into a history of human and more than human presence that goes beyond the advent of written records. Secondly, the move to greatly extended geological timelines means that scholars of translation are required to pay much more significant attention to the process and instantiation of translation in the analysis of material objects. And this is one of the things that's, if you like, a feature of a lot of eco-critical thinking at present is what's sometimes called the revenge of objects, that greater attentiveness to the materiality of the world that we inhabit, and how for so long that has been subject to forms of what are called Kantian correlationism, the idea that the material world only takes on a status when it's mediated through the human subject, and how this has been contested in various ways. And the third perspective is a convergence with other disciplines such as paleontology and archaeology, which proves more feasible as time, the fourth dimension in Cobus-Maria's terminology, is more broadly conceived. We might, for example, envisage future exhibitions devoted to translation that would be held in conjunction with museums of natural history, providing a chronologically more generous and inclusive definition of what is covered by translation, both in its conceptualization and practice. As we noted earlier, a more extensive awareness of deep time brings to the fore origin stories such as the non-human beginnings of humans. In a time of ecological crisis, humans become aware not of their superiority to, but of their dependency on the living world, which leads to a potential reawakening of sensitivity to interdependent animality. Rosie Berdotti has express this new sensitivity in terms of a transversal subjectivity. Being matter realist, to use her term, is to take seriously our multiple connections to the natural and material worlds that are revealed by the scalar alterations of deep time. So expanding the notion of subjectivity to include the more than human entails visualizing the subject, and I quote, as a transversal entity encompassing the human, our genetic neighbours, the animals, and the earth as a whole, and to do so within an understandable language. It's this search for new forms of subjectivity that haunts the main character Janina in Olga Tokarczuk's novel Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead. Janina, who is working on a Polish translation of William Blake's poems, is deeply distressed by the activities of the hunters in the border region she inhabits between Poland and the Czech Republic. As a translator, she feels eventually compelled to broaden her professional remit to include other forms of interpretation. When she encounters the hunter's prey of preference, the local deer, she observes, "They appeared before me like the stag to St. Hubert, to have me become the punitive hand of justice in secret, not just for the deers, but for other animals too, for they have no voice in Parliament." As Janina engages in a series of actions to avenge the death of the animals, I don't want to give any plot spoilers here for anybody who wants to, and I can strongly encourage you to read the book. She becomes, if you like, the voice, the interpreter for the deer in some kind of putative multi-species parliament of the future. However, is precisely the terms of Janina's diagnosis that test the limits of what is conventionally understood by translation. Not unexpectedly, she defines the animal's predicament as one of lack. They have no voice. Lacking human language, they are unintelligible, untranslatable. They are, if you like, the mute victims of unchecked violence in the region. Gemma Deere in Radical Animism, reading for the End of the World, reminds us that animals have repeatedly been characterized by the notion of lack. In ascribing a lack to non-human animals, we fall prey to the lure of a solipsistic anthropocentrism. We mistake our world for the world. We posit ourselves as superior to something to which we have no access, to something that we lack. As Deere points out, difference is not lack, is not privation. And she goes on to argue that difference is life itself. The evolution of more and more complex forms of life is down to differences in the copying of genetic material, differences which cumulatively produce diverse new forms. So, if translation, and thinking back to what I was, quotation from Barbara Cassin a little earlier on, is fundamentally about difference, translation after all exists because we encounter some form of difference that we feel compelled to negotiate, then we can appreciate translation as fundamental to life itself. However, this notion of translation, or this notion of life, needs to be understood in the transversal sense of a relational ontology. Humans' connectedness to our genetic neighbours, the animals, and the earth as a whole. It is precisely this sense of connectedness that becomes apparent when one examines more closely specific lines of exploration in semiotic research. Thomas Sebeok, one of the founding figures of Biosemiotics, claims that the process of message exchanges, or Biosemiosis is an indispensable characteristic of all terrestrial life forms. In a later work, he stated that biosemiosis between bacterial entities started more than 1,000 million years ago and are thus at the root of all communication. So the apprehension of these signs can take many different forms and operate at many different levels. It includes the interpretation of signs emanating from other animals, which are apprehended through sound, sight, taste, smell, touch, or gesture, chemical communication between plants, the interaction of organisms with non-organic elements of their environment, such as minerals or the weather, and semiotic processes occurring at cellular and molecular levels. So the interconnectivity of living systems, which are in many respects radically different from each other, demand forms of translation that do not eliminate but are necessitated by and constituted by their mutual difference. So this leads Murray, for example, to conclude that the full scope of translation should include examples of non-lingual communication, such as the intra-specific communication between acacia trees, which communicate chemically with surrounding trees when they're being browsed by kudu, or the communication between members of a pack of wolves. If focusing on human historical time can lead to animals, as we saw in the Tokarczuk example, as being primarily defined by the lack of human symbolic language, extending the time frame of analysis to the emergence of organic life, as in Subjectivity's claim, leads to the inevitable reconfiguration of translation away from an exclusively interlingual purview. The implications of this translational reconfiguration for our understanding of deliberative democracy are profound. The extent and severity of the current climate crisis indicates a dramatic failure in the representative and legal systems that have been wholly subordinated to human interests and have largely ignored the interests of the more than human world. The non-human, seen as devoid of language and moral personhood, is excluded from forms of meaningful participation in deliberative fora and has no control over decisions that often threaten its very existence. The international law doctrine of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, which is at the heart of international environmental law, states that that each state has the inalienable right to dispose of their natural wealth and resources in accordance with their national interests. The consequence of this politico-legal ontology is that the non-human is understood and therefore treated as a merely property and inert matter. It does not exist if humans believe they do not have a use for it. The project of ecological democracy, which I've entitled elsewhere Zoonocracy, and eco-translation, is a way of responding to this crisis in political representation, which is playing out in the catastrophic consequences of global warming, fires, floods, acidification of the oceans, and the sixth major extinction of species on Earth. John Dryzak and Jonathan Pickering, in their recent book, The Politics of the Anthropocene, have described liberal democracy as a Holocene institution, which has, and I quote, developed a pathological path dependency which decouples human institutions from the Earth system by embodying feedback mechanisms that systematically repress information about the condition of the Earth system and systematically prioritize narrow economic concerns. So, in broadening the sense of how democratic participation and representation are conceived of in the age of the Anthropocene, Anthony Burke and Stephanie Fishel have argued that, I quote, the recognition of the material presence and agency of ecosystems and non-human lives, and the resistant power of non-human assemblages. So they're calling for this, and they go on to call for what they call a post-Holocene ontology of inclusion, one that rests not merely upon an organism-focused emphasis on animal rights, but the prior existence, presence, and power of non-human lives and processes, as they are manifested in vast and dynamic assemblages of beings across the Earth system. Implicit, if you like, in this ontology of inclusion is an ecological ideal of political communication, where the constituent groups, human and non-human alike, are intelligible to each other in ways that make just deliberation possible. Burke and Fischel, echoing the insights of scholars from the field of biosemiotics alluded to earlier, claim that non-human animals possess complex systems of exchange, solidarity, and communication between and across species. And this communicative complexity, if you like, requires an appropriate response. We must not merely recognize that humans are obviously sentient or communicative animals, can be understood to communicate, but non-sentient changes in matter, form, and energy as they interact with the biosphere and other components of the Earth system as well. In this light, the invisibility of the other than human is a globally pathological situation. The demand that the non-human must either speak our political language or remain mute was always cast in the wrong direction. It is we who must learn the Earth's language and reimagine the polity in its idioms. What is the word that is absent here in their deliberations? The word that's absent, of course, is translation. If you're going to talk about idioms, that implies that there is difference and diversity, and that translation must be called upon to establish a meaningful interface between these idioms. In this context, it seems to me appropriate to speak of terra translation, which I would argue is the translation of the idioms of the Earth between the human and the non-human. The necessity of terra translation proves all the more apparent when proposals are made for forms of transnational governance that would embrace the inclusive ontology of ecological democracy. Burke and Fischel, for example, argue for the establishment of United Nations Earth System Council and a global ecoregion assembly. The Earth System Council would be primarily responsible for the safeguarding of the global environment and the Earth system. The Global Ecoregion Assembly would consist of representatives from 15 global ecoregions, and these ecoregions would cover areas with broadly similar climates and a limited range of ecosystem biome types. Both bodies would have democratically elected representatives acting as proxies for human and non-human communities. But of course, one of the obvious skills of these representative proxies is the need to be versed in the idioms of the non-human constituencies they claim to represent. In effect, terra translation would not only be central, but essential to their political efficacy. Or to put this another way, any theory of ecological democracy is going to need a viable theory of translation. Just as the advent of transnational institutions after the Second World War gave rise to the emergence of translation theory and education in Europe and elsewhere, the advent of transnational ecological governance would inevitably generate a new kind of translation imperative, the need for terra translation. Translation curricula and training would need to be radically revised to take account of these new forms of translation. The third form of translation that I want to speak about, and I'll speak about it very, very briefly, is, and again, it's bound up with this notion of deep time, is the idea of nuclear translation. And this is basically a kind of was prompted by a description in Robert McFarlane's book Underland, where he talks about a waste treatment facility, it's nuclear waste in New Mexico, and the people who constructed this waste treatment facility decided that they needed to find some way of letting people know in 10,000 years' time that this was a bad place, that you shouldn't go near this place. The difficulty was, what kind of communication systems will exist 10,000 years from now? In other words, how are we going to communicate with people in this very distant future, if we think about the lives and afterlives of atomic waste and matter? So a number of different committees were convened. Some of them suggested that you have what was called bristle architecture, which means it would be so difficult to get into this place that people would eventually get the message and not go there. The other was they produced these little kind of emojis, the favorite one being Edward Monk's The Screen, so you wouldn't go there. Thomas Sebeok, that I mentioned earlier, advocated the development of what he called an atomic priesthood. What this atomic priesthood would do, of course, very patriarchal in its conceptualization, but at any rate, what they would do is they would develop stories and myths. And these stories and myths would be passed down through generations to warn people about this place and how contaminated a place it was. But what struck me in how these people were thinking about the notion of communication and communication across time and communication across extended periods of time is they were looking at it in terms of deep time and looking in translational terms. How do you, if you like, carry this particular message across different spaces and times? And this in turn, if you like, is linked to the fundamental intuition that Timothy Morton, a kind of philosopher of translation, has about the notion of what he says in the present age, that we're grappling what he calls hyper-objects. So hyper-objects are something that are greatly extended in space and time, and that they're so huge that we often find it difficult to make sense of them. So if I throw away a styrofoam cup, I'm not thinking about the consequence of that cup for somebody living 400 or 500 years into the future, because how can I think even that far ahead in terms of my own lifestyle, so my own lifetime? So this, if you like, then means that the notion of the hyper-object and thinking about the hyper-object and think about the hyper-object in terms of extended scales of time means you have to think translationally. You've got to think about how does translation, if you like, provide some kind of conceptual correlative to the notion of the hyper-object. What is, if you like, what we're going to think translationally in order to allow us to conceive of some potential or possible future. But having talked at length about the fourth dimension of translation, time, I think I've just run out of the same commodity myself, and it's probably time to, for me at any rate, to stop speaking. Thank you.
If there are any questions for Michael Cronin, now is your chance. Sorry, it's not entirely related, but the trees that communicate when they're being eaten by the small mammals, I can't remember what the name was, what do the trees do in response to that?
Well, one thing they've sort of discovered is that trees, I mean, they exist in relation to each other, but they also sort of coexist with forms of fungal communication coexistence. But one thing that's kind of emerged in recent decades is just the extraordinary kind of complexity, of fungal communication systems. How fungal communication systems in forests allow trees, for example, one thing they do in response to particular forms of predation is they begin to redistribute leaf load. So if the attack is coming from one side of the tree, they will tend to try to displace leaf production to the other side of the tree. Another thing is what they call vertical extension, so the leaves will tend to fly higher up in the tree because certain mammals find it more difficult or more dangerous or riskier to. But to some extent, in order to do that, they need to, I suppose this is where the biosemiotics comes into the picture, they need to have access to particular kinds of information. And some of the information is something that comes from the immediate environment, but other forms of information are information that both comes through taproot systems and also through the kind of the fungal communication systems that they have in the forest. Because one of the things that's very, very interesting, a philosopher called Emmanuel Coetzee, he wrote a book a number of years ago called The Miraculous Life of Plants, where he says the fundamental difficulty for plants, as well as applied to trees, is how to deal with fixity. Right? You develop a set of strategies to deal with the fact that when flight is not an option, how do you respond? And of course, this is one of the great kind of drivers, for evolutionary adaptation, is precisely to adapt to all kinds of ecological pressures that are brought to bear. But thank you, that's a very good question.
If I can ask a question, you I suppose, advocated that people should think translationally, as you put it. It seems to me that is something which will meet enormous political resistance, because what you're effectively asking people to do is to relativize the world of speech, and, if you like, the politics of the world is based on speech between humans. So you're asking people to fundamentally alter the way they communicate, and it seems to me that is, politically at least, an extremely big ask, particularly when one sees how the world is reacting to the challenge of climate change.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it would be foolish to underestimate the particular the enormity, the scale of what one is asking for, and I think but I think there's, two things I would say in response to that, John. I think the first is we don't have an option. In other words, if we don't take this seriously, and we don't take this kind of the notion of where the more than human figures in our deliberative democracies seriously, the game's up. Because we simply won't have conceptual tools to allow us to deal with climate change. But I think the second, I think this is, one thing that Freud argued many years ago is there were three kind of what he called conceptual disappointments for humans. The first was when Kepler, Copernicus, and Galileo told them they were along the centre of the universe, that the sun was. Then when Darwin turned up in the 19th century and says, hey lads, you're just one animal amongst many others in the animal kingdom, you're not given some exalted status intrinsically, in the animals. The second one, and then of course Freud, who's no slacker when it came to self-promotion, says, I'm the third person because I'm telling you that your id is playing havoc, with your superego and the kind of the rational administrative system of the ego and superego. So, and I think to some extent, when we talk about the kind of the post-human or the end-human existentialism, or when I talk about translational thinking, just as there was huge resistance, to the development of the heliocentric model, just as there was huge resistance to the Darwinian, redescription of the humans in the natural world, just there was huge resistance to some of the psychoanalytic insights that Freud and others brought to bear on human thinking. I think, yes, of course, there would be resistance to this. But I think to some extent, our options are narrowing, and we have to think about. In terms of one of the things that kind of interests me in presence is this notion of eco-jurisprudence and how you give intrinsic legal rights to mountains, rivers, trees, and so on. And then it's the notion of kind of mediation or representation. So who represents the rivers, who represents the streams, who articulates there. And it seems to me this is all down to questions of interpretation and translation. And how you distinguish between what I would call instrumental forms of translation and hermeneutic forms of translation. So the instrumental meaning is a kind of, it's a kind of smash and grab operation. So I want to know what exactly that plant does, so I can make human medicinal products from that plant. So it's, so I want to try and understand, if you like, the plant for human gain. And hermeneutics more, how do you understand the plant as a kind of a separate entity with its own life, its own separateness. But there is certainly no doubt in my mind that there would be enormous pushback when it comes to this. But to some extent, that's a subset of a much larger problem, which is how do we, in society, culture, and economy, are so saturated with thinking of human exceptionalism? How do we cope with a world where the more than human is coming back and hitting us with a whack? As we just lived through 3 years. Something that's, a zoonotic disease that was transmitted by the kinds of, globalized forms of economic activity and air travel that we engage in. So it was a long answer, John. Bless you.
I read somewhere that in the Middle Ages they thought God had written 2 books, one being the Bible, the other being the World. And in a way, your idea of interpreting realities is the second part of that. But there's something in the translation system that makes you want to have an intention behind everything that exists. And things just existing for their own sake isn't good enough. That the way you deal with animals in the end is to anthropomorphize them and to think that they're really humans in disguise, hence German literature. And somehow that the model of translation has to overcome a huge act of imagination, or even go beyond imagination, in order to do its work on the scales that you outline. Is there a way around that?
I think to some extent, thank you, Cronin, for that question. I mean, I think the answer already lies in the history of translation itself. Because one thing about translation is that it's not so much the kind of the untranslatable, which becomes slightly fetishistic concept in translation studies in recent times. But it's more the fact that's acknowledged by many different kinds of translators, is that translation can always be better, that there's always a residue there, there's always something more that can be said, something more that can be translated, that the translation itself is always, it's almost more like a kind of receding horizon of expectation, that you're always kind of going towards this notion of translatability, which is always escaping you at some level, which is of course why we're always appalled when we read our translations a year later. And what a horrible sentence, and it's so clunky, and it's kind of cringe-inducing, particularly if it goes into print. There's no escape. So I think to some extent, what you find when translators are being honest about translation, is they will talk a lot about things that resist the translation, the kind of the areas of opacity in translated text. And this seems to me that kind of almost kind of epistemic humility that you get from the act of translation, something that very usefully inform our kind of relationship to thinking about the degrees to which we can understand or engage with the more than human world. Because the thing about, I always think that with translation, it's always communication across difference, not communication to abolish difference, because difference itself is the very founding condition of translation. So to that extent, it seems to me that there's the kind of a record in translation itself that makes us more optimistic. But I think your point there about the book of the world, I mean, we often emphasize a particular kind of Judeo-Christian tradition that where Adam is given sort of governance of the creatures of the earth. But of course, there is this whole other tradition of natural theology, which saw the kind of the immanence of the world itself as testimony to a kind of complexity that was beyond the human. So I sometimes think that medieval translation scholars, very interesting kind of area of research there in rediscovering that in different ways.
Thank you so much. It was an absolutely fascinating departure for me from my literary translator background into scientific immersion, which leads me to my question of how can the translation studies field actually stay abreast of this rapidly changing need for concepts and languages. There's the lexis that I wonder. I look at the slides that you presented, and with my language pairing Russian to English, I honestly wouldn't know where to begin. So how within the field are you going to do you team up with scientists to actually stay abreast of the lexical requirements, and how do you actually predict what's going to be required in terms of teaching this? How do we actually integrate it so fully whilst not actually falling behind? Because it sounds to me like it needs to be constantly updating.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think there's two elements to it. I think the first is, I just got involved with a project here in Trinity, and a PhD student starting with me, and it's a project called Digitizing Biodiversity, which is basically it's a group of engineers, computer scientists, botanists, zoologists, who are looking at the impact of wind turbines on kind of local or human populations, so insects, birds, small mammals, earthworms, and so on. And one of the things that from my standpoint, we're trying to do in this particular project is to look at how are the scientists translating what it is they're perceiving, like how they're using their kind of sensory technologies and so on, and what are the kind of translational processes that are going on there, and then when it arises in human symbolic language, what is the kind of the translational chain that's happening? Try to understand this in very concrete and specific ways. So that, if you like, is the kind of what I call where you're kind of scientist citizen, you're actually involved in a research project. I think the other is, to some extent, it's thinking about translation or translators in society, or human translators in society, but in a society and a world that's evolving quite rapidly. And it seems to me that with climate change as such a central part of how we now constitute both our present and our future, it is a new changed set of circumstances, and that's going to require new kinds of analysis, and new kinds of analysis bring with them new kinds of vocabularies. The only thing I hope that those vocabularies will be useful ones. There's nothing worse than what they used to call in the 17th century inkhorn terms. Great kind of clunking neologisms that obscure rather than illuminate. So I think one's got to be vigilant always in using sets of distinctions. But it is nonetheless the case, I think, that we are in this this new era, and we're going to need a new language to talk about it. But that is a very good question.
Thank you very much. I'd like like to thank Michael for a most stimulating lecture. As usual, pushing out the boundaries of translation studies. And on a practical note, there will be now a reception in the Translation Centre on Phelan Street, which is a short walk through the college. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Trinity, there will be a few pace setters who will walk you through the college to the Translation Centre. So thank you all very much.